Okay, great. Well, first of all, thanks, Elena and Karin, for having me and inviting me over. It's a pleasure to meet so many colleagues who work on similar aspects of African women's history. I'm an economic historian and actually economist by training, and economists like to quantify things, so economic historians in particular. So this will be maybe a more quantitative take on African women's history, I would say. Right? This presentation is fed by 3 papers, actually 2 only very marginally, and 1 bigger one that is right now working paper that is working with the marriage registers. I will talk about the sources more. So the title is Gender Inequality in British Colonial Africa, Evidence from Urban Anglican Converts, or you could also have said evidence from Anglican marriage registers, because this is my main source I've been drawing on since PhD days, and I'm still drawing on that data collection I did during my PhD time in Uganda, and then also afterwards in a project in which I tried to I collected marriage registers of the Anglican Church across British former colonial Africa. Okay. Some of this work is also joined with Jacob Weisdorf from Sapienza. Is that okay, or am I moving too much? Okay, cool.
I think so.
Okay, just to give you a motivation, and you will later see a bit the sources and the methods I'm using, but to give you a sort of an introduction or motivation to the work I've been doing, is that Christian missions have been supplying the bulk of education for most of the colonial era, certainly in British colonies until the 1940s. Definitely they phased out a bit, but even post-independence, former Christian churches were still providing a lot of primary education. Right? This is mainly due to African demand for formal education, although there's always a debate, is this the chicken and egg problem, is it the supply or the demand, but without African demand, Christian missions would have been unable to spread as much as they did in areas where there was no pre-existing, for example, Islam, right? They did not strive there at all. However, access and also the nature of missionary education was extremely, I don't know why it's moving, unevenly distributed, right, between the sexes. The curriculum was mostly geared towards very much stressing Victorian gender norms, focusing on sewing in particular, very different curricula for women and men. I guess I don't have to convince this audience that this was the case, but in particular stressing the role of domesticity. Right? And blue, there are papers that have been working on this. Another thing which I was unaware until 2 years actually ago was that, like most people, I guess we would ask on the street, what kind of picture do you have of a missionary in Africa? Most of them will say they're white and they're male, right? That's at least sort of the collective memory people would have. But that's actually not true. By the 1920s, if we just look at Protestant European missionaries now, the majority were already female. Right? These were partly obviously the wives of these missionaries, but there was a sort of professionalization within that. The missionary societies changed their strategy. They wanted to get away from the, let's say, less efficient missionary wife to a professional teacher who would be better on and would have more time basically in devoting herself to the teaching at missions, right? So there's a change among Protestant missions in that regard, and focusing on the single missionary. Right? Still, so this is maybe some picture to emphasize again the type of curriculum, mostly for men. This was reading and writing and other aspects. But for women, the curriculum would always be dominated by sewing and home economics, cooking, and these are some of pictures now from Ghana and also here from Tanzania that would always portray. Another graph to convince you that education became extremely unequal over the colonial era is research I did with Michiel de Haas and colleagues. And here we used 21 million individuals we captured through the census that we can all download via iPumps. And the great thing is that for 21 countries, they also state the year of birth, right? So modern censuses can be used in order to extract basically information about literacy status or years of education in the past, assuming that schooling is something that is happening early in life, and I think that assumption is not so arbitrary. So these are the year of birth ordered by year, the gender gap, so comparing men and women regarding the number of years they spent in school and by their birth cohort, right? So this starts in 1895 and goes up to 1980. These are the censuses from the 1990s for which we can extract. So that's one method how we can learn about the past in terms of gendered access to education using census. And we can see that in terms of the gender gap here is rising over the colonial era, is peaking in the 1950s and then starts to decline. Right? So these are the people born in the 1950s. They're probably then schooled in the late 50s, 60s. So there's a gap of around 1.5 to almost 2 years between men and women on average across these 21 sub-Saharan African countries. They report that information. Right? We plotted this over the total years of education in general, just to see how the total expansion of education, how did gender inequality evolve relative to the expansion of education. Here we just sum up the total years of education, and we see that over the colonial era, yes, you have quite an expansion. On average, people go to school, around 2 years in 1940, those who were born in 1940, but the 50s moved to 3, and then further on, by 1980, it's on average 6 years of schooling both men and women have obtained. Right? So this is one way how we try to make sense of the huge data sets, 21 million observations from censuses, and taking it back using a birth cohort approach in order to get an idea how gender inequality in terms of access to education evolved over time. Right? And there's still inequality. We could draw it a bit further, but it's declining, but there's still a gender gap in education nowadays. Okay, so we know we can say quite something about access to education, but what about occupations? What did this education translate into for men and women, right? That's the question. What were the benefits, actually, of this missionary education, right? If nobody ended up in the labor market, then maybe the benefits are differently. Maybe these are network effects. Maybe this is about meeting your husband or your wife on Sunday in church. So, I mean, these benefits of joining the missionary movement at the time are quite variegated, right? But one could be, if we think about missions providing education, one could be the education channel. But what did this education actually meant for converts, right? So this is a question we ask in this paper, and particularly for women. And I'm quoting our friend Adrian Hastings here that saying that all in all, African society was apparently so male-dominated that the impact of Christianity upon it has been treated overwhelmingly in male terms. Well, we have acknowledged that yesterday as well. The social analysis has stopped, however, well short of a gender analysis. So we provide now some idea how occupations have evolved over the colonial era for a certain subset of individuals I will talk about in a second. Okay. yeah, well, I made this point before that that we see this feminization of the mission in terms of European personnel, right? So just a bit repeating here myself, but you see this, that in terms of, these are the Western staff over time, from 1881 to 1922, and we see this change basically from 1910, that mission societies increasingly invested or hired women missionaries, and by 1920 or by 1916 they make up half. By 1922 it's 55%. In terms of African staff, well, first thing, that's something also that is important, because we have very good data on European missionaries, right? Their histories are quite glorified, but we forget that actually 87 of missionary workers were African, right? This is not a European movement. This is a largely supported and financed by Africans, right? Giving land, providing labor, building churches, and teaching also in these churches. They're rarely named missionaries in the sources, because you could only be a missionary if you were basically European or Western, but they were then called catechists. But they were probably much more efficient in teaching in the vernacular than European. So 87% of mission staff, Protestant mission staff, were actually African. However, few of those actually are women. So if the share of women, African women working in these missions, are below 10%. In terms of total numbers, they equal their European peers, like the European women, but in terms of a relative share, they're making up much less. And maybe this is less relevant for this audience, but there's quite, at least in economic history and economics in particular, there's quite large literature of around, by now, almost 100 papers that are interested in the long-term effects. So they correlate the location of missions 100 years ago, let's say 1920, with outcomes today, to check if is there a legacy, are there long-term effects. And we can make of this literature what we want, but typically there are very positive effects regarding education. So most papers find that former locations where there were missions in 1920, they're more, people are more educated until the present day. Right? And they do try to control in their regressions in a way that that the endogeneity of the location, that maybe the location is just better developed, and that's why the missionaries went there, right? They did not make random choices of where they built mission stations, right? So they went where people are, where there's economic development, and potentially richer Africans to have greater demand. But in general, they're quite positive in terms of education, and for Protestants in particular for women. Okay? This is the long-term correlation of 100 years, connecting 1920 to but that's also one literature that exists out there. So what I'm trying to do in this paper, and now I'm only focusing on one method, and that will be marriage registers. I collected, and these are basically 3 questions I'm trying to ask. And that's, what were the returns to mission education in British colonial African capital cities? Did African men and women actually benefit equally from their mission education during the colonial era? Right? We're not asking these long-term questions. Did missions matter for today? And we don't really know what to do with these results. Secondly, how did this materialize in household gender inequality? Really also household gender inequality, because we're able to capture husband and wife, which is quite unique, in the formal colonial labor economy among an emerging Christian middle class or elite, also Christina Mann would maybe call them, not entirely sure, but probably. Yeah. And did pre-colonial gender roles, in particular in trade, specialization in trade, influence Christian women's colonial labor force participation in West and East Africa? It's a question we think we can ask to the data as well. I will come to that at the end. So in order to answer these questions, we need data. In our data, well, first of all, there's sort of at least when we started the project with the observation there's actually quite some absence of longitudinal, systematic, consistent data over a really long time span, let's say 100 years. For every year, where do we get observations, in particular on African women, and if we can, microdata even better, on the social and economic lives of African women, and also men, because it's nice to compare and have a relative idea how they've been doing. So this is something I started during, as I mentioned, during a PhD I did in Uganda, and afterwards I extended this research to other countries I'm going to present in a second. And this was basically came about, I was working at a university called Mountains of the Moon University in Western Uganda, and on the board of this university was also the bishop of Toro district, and we had a chat, and he invited me to come over to his church. It's one of the earliest mission churches, and so I did, and I asked him, so what kind of reports do you still have there? And I knew a bit the work of the CAMPOP, the Cambridge Population Group, using the Church of England vital statistics, going back to the, I think, what is it, 16th century, right? I think 1950, I think the series start. And I had a look at the reports, and I said, oh, wow, these marriage registers, they are printed actually in London. They look identical to the Church of England registers. We'll have a look in a second how they look like, with very interesting data. Okay, maybe let's have a look at it while. Well, maybe let's go with the slides. Otherwise, it gets confusing. Okay, so that, and then I digitized this material for Portal, and I went around. I did the same for the earliest churches in Uganda, 30 churches, getting a data set of around 150,000 individuals in Uganda. And for this paper, however, we're using now the information I collected afterwards. After venturing then out, I asked then the Bishop of Kampala, oh, could you get me in touch with your colleague in Nairobi and in Mombasa? Okay, that worked quite well, but then making the bridge to West Africa, to Nigeria, and to Freetown was more difficult. Well, it was quite a, oh yeah, there's a renew session. So a lot of time actually went into contacting the bishops and introducing myself, and also that I'm not purely there for the data, but also I'm very keen in preserving these Christian heritage for eternity, and obviously these records are in a bad shape, and they're very much aware of it. And there have been no digitization efforts whatsoever so far, and there were often actually, when I arrived with just a white sheet of paper and a little brush to clean them, there was like, oh, and a camera, right? And this was not a very sophisticated. This was a good Lumix camera, yes, fine, but no tripod, nothing. Right? Because in order to make time, you would stand like this, and you would digitize like that. The quality is good, but maybe the British Library would complain how we would have done better, right? Sure. But all the information is on it, and so there were sometimes also surprised how simple this was. Oh, we could have done that ourselves. True. But I did it for them, and I left a USB stick always at each location where I did this. Right? So this was, in the end, for this paper, I'm only focusing on the capital cities to keep it consistent, on almost 30,000 African groom and bride pairs over the period 1840 to 70, plus there were also some British settlers in Nairobi and also in Lagos marrying there, and I'm adding them to the sample to have this comparison, also asking, do these gender trends and gender-specific labor market trends, are they unique to, is this like an African phenomenon, or is this a more global or process of female emancipation? So we can add also the European grooms and brides as a comparator. So this is how these magic registers look like. They look really alike their English records. That's me in Nairobi cleaning, as I told you about the simple methods I came with, and that's in Kampala with the Dean of Namirembe Cathedral. Yeah. So this is an overview of the sample for this paper now. Overall, I mean, there are around 300,000 pictures I've taken together with local photographers, or they were not photographers, I actually trained them in an hour how to make nice photos. I recruited students or people I got hold of sort of on the way to help me. I always came with 3 cameras and a lot of batteries. But this is the sample, how it looks like over time. The African couples and the British. And we see at the start, this is mostly Freetown, right? There were no missionaries really expanding before the 50s elsewhere, except in Freetown, which was a very obviously Christian place. And then you see the sample just grows. More people marry in these churches. Also the sample gets stronger from the 1900s. We have observations basically from everywhere. And these are the British guys. Although I'm not entirely sure whether they're all British, but it's very likely that they're mostly British, so I label them as British. They could also be just Europeans. So finally, how does the material look like? The material looks like the follows. So this is now an example from Ibadan, Nigeria, from the church of Aremo. And first you have here the date or the year, the date the marriage was performed. You have on top the groom, and then below the wife, the name. You have the age at marriage. So he was 24, she was 20. You have their occupations, right? There's the self-stated occupations at the time of marriage. He's a farmer and she's a petty trader. The residence, right, where they lived, what you also have is the occupation of their fathers, not of their mothers, but both come from farming backgrounds. And then we also know whether they were able to sign their marriage certificate. If they were able, they would have written their own name. If they were unable, it would either be a thumbprint or an X mark, right? That's here. So we would code them as, in terms of signature literacy, as illiterate, a 0 rather than a 1. A very simple coding. So this is the information we get from this. How we treat the occupations is important, and for our purpose of this paper, we divide their work into 3 categories. One could go into much more detail, but we are interested in women's relative performance to men in terms of accessing formal work, waged jobs that we consider. Shall I admit that guy?
No, we are.
Ah, okay. Wage work, bringing home an independent income, giving financial independence also to women is one important, so that we would consider this quite an empowering category. Then there's the self-employed, informal, so these are the market traders. They also bring home independent income. And there's quite some difference between East and West Africa. I will come to that. And then the other one is a larger category of homemaker. These are the housewives, but also would be farmers. We can have some discussion about where to put them, because that's also crucial. We have our ideas. There's some difficult categories, like a seamstress or a mat maker, which would get a different coding in let's say in the European sense, but in the early colonial era, seamstresses, certainly in Uganda, would not have their own tailoring shop, but this would be, we think that's rather something you pick up in missionary school, you associate with that skill, and you state that you're a seamstress. But this is not really something where a lot of money is made, at least according to the secondary literature. But that's, we can talk about that. I'm also curious, maybe you have ideas, maybe you say, oh no, I disagree here. But I will show you the most important occupations later and see what you think. Okay. So these are the places I visited. I also visited Tanzania, but there were no records left of the Anglican Church, and at least nothing for that period, unfortunately. But I was quite happy wherever I went elsewhere. These were quite successful journeys in terms of data collection and also a lot of fun. Except, I must say, in Accra, the Anglican Church did not play a big role. That this Presbyterian Methodist land, later the Catholics from the late 1880s come in. Here we draw on different data on civil marriage registers. We downloaded from Family Search. Right, this is this website of the Mormons where you can baptize people after their death. That's why. Why wouldn't you, right? So this is a bit upsetting, you would say. Oh, okay, now you're adding to your apples pears or plums. Yes, we are open, but we find very similar. We think it's still interesting to have from Accra these 10,000 couples for whom we know of the occupations and who got married. But we acknowledge that they might be different to maybe the Anglican peers in the other colonies. Okay, but we still have it in there as some data. Here, this is Nairobi, the big cathedral in All Saints, where initially white settlers mostly married, and this was the cathedral where Kenyans were marrying close to the railroads. St. Stephen's. Later, that's swaps from the 50s. Also, Kenyans are getting married in there. St. George, the oldest cathedral in sub-Saharan Africa, outside South Africa, in Freetown. But most of the story for Freetown is a bit different. It was actually an unsuccessful journey, despite being welcomed by the Bishop of Freetown, and but the data again was not really there. And we discussed this on the way. There was no good explanation for why the records were missing, except that maybe the Civil War. But yeah. I don't know, but I went to 10 different churches, and there was basically hardly anything except for the more recent period. I was lucky to get to know someone who knew someone in the IT office of the Register General, and in theory, this is a place, the Register General office, where all of these marriage records should also be kept. So what happened? Back in the days, or until today, if you get married, the church produces 3 certificates. One for the couple, one remains in the church, and the other one goes to the local government. So in theory, if we are looking for occupational data through marriage records, in theory, the Register General in all countries should keep these records with occupational data. So that would be something that only came to... I was focusing on the churches, but actually Register General has that information. And Freetown demonstrated this, so I went there. I got access to their archive, which is a working archive. So they also they still work. They pull out registries from nowadays there as well. But that was an incredible treasure trove. So the records went back to 1828 in bad shape, some, but it was relatively complete for every year. You had almost, not only the Anglicans, you had the Baptists, the Methodists, the Presbyterians, the Catholics, also Islamic marriages, all was there. So spent more than a week there with 2 colleagues digitizing that stuff. But for this purpose of this paper here, that's at the Register General Archive. Does this maybe, if I touch, is this a touch screen?
No.
Okay, so automatically moving anyway. So in that archive you not only have the Anglicans, but everybody. So I digitized also everybody. But for this paper, I'm only focusing on the Anglicans to keep as much as possible the pairs at par. Yeah, other places in Ibadan, but I will. This is. I don't know why this is jumping all the time. Yeah, Holy Trinity in Lagos, St. Saviour's. This is where Europeans got married. The only place where I was denied access, and absolutely, that's all, of course, legitimate, was Christ Cathedral in Lagos. That's where the ultra Lagos elite is marrying, right? They have marble floor from Italy, they have chandeliers from Paris. That's where they were said, no, Dr. Felix, I'm afraid here we can't grant you access, while anywhere else this was possible. Fair enough. Okay, so I mean, one critical question is who appears in this marriage register, and I won't have enough time to talk too much about this, but obviously this is not a representative sample. This is not anybody who got married per se. This is by default people who joined the missionary movement. They converted to Christianity, to Anglicanism. There were certain access rules also of your parents not being polygamous, for example, in order to receive mission education. But leaving them aside, just focusing on our sample, we can just compare their signature literacy with those from the censuses by birth cohort. Right? You can just get a feeling. And first of all, you see these Anglican men and women from the sample in Kampala, Freetown, Nairobi, they're almost 100% literate by 1910, right? And also before 1900. This is an extremely literate sample, right? So that's also no surprise. These are people who are close to the missionary movement. They've gone probably to missionary churches, schools and churches, and they married within that, right? And we can see that in particular here, the census here, it's much lower, right? For women, they're actually twice as literate as they should be for those who are locating in Freetown or in Kampala. Those are born during that time period. Again, I'm using the census data I showed you before, the inverse U-shaped curve of educational spread. And here for Nairobi, it's even more dramatic. All the women are literate in the sample, while in theory, or not in theory, in empirical practice, 26% should be. Right? So this is a relatively Christian-educated sample, obviously part also of an elite. Joining the Anglican Church was also one strategy of preserving pre-existing elitism. Right? For example, the history of Uganda, of the Baganda, makes it quite clear. All the Baganda chiefs become Anglican chiefs. They keep their function. That way, the Baganda, there's mass conversion. There's no country probably in the world that has seen so much conversion in the shortest time period in history, I would claim, here now, in a very short time period. Right? And there's similar examples on Lagos by the Yoruba, for example. Christina Mann has written quite something in the 80s, 90s on this, and particularly about that elite. Right? So that's important to keep in mind. Still, we think we should not throw away. Dominic, do you have a question? No. Oh no. We still think this is a very interesting sample to look at gender inequality, sort of of the upper classes in these places that are very close to, well, European influences, maybe not the best word, but close to the colonial administration and to these mission churches. Right? Having self-selected them into that position to preserve their pre-existing status potentially. Yeah, so this is, we're not making a lot about literacy rates because that's not very fascinating, and because it's just showing the expected. If we have such a sample, we see literacy rates also rising very fast, as I've shown by the 1880s, 90s, 100% of men and also women, doesn't say, here in Freetown are literate, and here in Kampala Obviously, missionaries only arrive much later than in Freetown, but we have the same movement basically here by the 1910 and later by the 1920s. They're all literate. And we will use that information later for the early colonial area to do a certain test. Okay. So we have a very literate sample. We don't know much about, this is signature literacy, so we don't know really about the quality of education. We just know, are they able to sign that? So that's just an indicator for us whether they have received education, whether they have gone to a missionary school, learned to hold a pen and sign their name. That's it, right? So it's not a very sophisticated measure of human capital. Yeah, but now let's turn to the coding we have done in terms of formal education. Formal work. This is wage work, and I will show you the occupations in a second. But before that, this is how it looks if we aggregate all the data for every 5 years, 5-year periods over time. So what we see is that women barely. So we see two things basically: one relatively flat experience, and then one rupture in the 40s that is quite similar across places, right? And that's what we find quite striking. So first of all, women, that means barely participated in wage labor. We have a look in when they participated, what they did, and that's across the board. So right, we don't have a lot of observations for Ibadan for that time period, but in general, so I would not overestimate this. We see a relatively flat line, always below 10%, on average around 5%. Okay. What is really interesting is that from the so Lagos is also doing a bit better, sure, women in Lagos. But what we see among our Anglican women is that from the 1940s, around Second World War, it's exploding, right? Wow. And it's exploding very fast. You know, that's unexpected to have such a fast trend. So one interpretation is that since this is a sort of an elite sample, these were the women who stood in pole position to get these wage labor jobs once they became available, opened for women as well. Right? These are all, as you will see, jobs, secretary, stenographers, expansion of education also, right? This is the Africanization period. Education expanded, so they become teachers, also nurses. While before, the only two occupations that women were able to enter until the 30s were working for the mission, being nurses and teachers. These were the only two options in terms of wage labor we observe in the data. But here, this is really, and we devote later some more detail to that. Right? So that's very interesting to see that, obviously this is not the case for all women at the time, but as we say, we say that these women were probably the best educated, they had the best networks in sort of accessing these jobs, with their fathers also potentially working for them and their husbands, and they were able to access them once they became, once they were demanded, right? Once they were open for women as well. We can add the British settlers as well, and we see that this is not really an African phenomenon per se, right? They follow very similar patterns. So these are the dotted lines here, the gray and the orange one. And yes, they accelerate even faster, but they come from a very similar. So also women, British women living in the colonies were not doing much better in terms of accessing wage labor. They were prone to the same Victorian ideals, we argue. So finally, some occupations. So these are the top 10 occupations for each place. You will be surprised, Nairobi very little, because the sample only from the 1930s starts to increase. We don't have good data, or we don't have only 50 observations pre-1930. So this is before the 1930s, the period for all places, because you have seen this structural break. From the late 1930s, we see this jump, right? So this is about the period in which women are not having barely any access, right? So what were they doing? Teaching, nurses, some secretary, clerk here in Freetown, Accra, teacher, yeah, clerk. So these are percentages, by the way. an Ibadan, teacher, housemaid, servants, nurses and teachers, Kampala, teacher, cook, nurse, clerk, but very small, right? In Kampala, it's not going beyond 3%. And in Nairobi, everybody are reported as being housewives. Okay. We have this category homemakers in green, and well, feel free to take issue with our coding, but the housewives are quite clear homemakers. The seamstresses, this is according to our reading, and also that women were not. This was mostly a home activity, and some stuff maybe was taken to the market, mostly either by them or by their husbands, but it was mostly something that took place, was a side activity, and at home, and is rather an identification with the skill obtained in mission schools, which were dominating sewing. So we have a lot of sewing in here, right? You see the seamstress here, seamstress here, seamstress here, 15%. The dressmakers we have not coded, and I think we have a dressmaker expert also in the audience. Yeah, exactly. So I'm keen to learn from you later also whether we have not coded them as homemakers right now, but I think because we thought this is maybe one of the first actually that they actually work as sort of entrepreneurs at the time. But I'm curious to learn more about that. Kampala, the amount of mat makers and basket weavers is enormous, and there's this book by Kimohendo and McIntosh, and they make very clear that this is a home activity. This is not really a very commercial one. There would not be as much demand as basket weavers and mat makers. This was a sort of a hobby, let's call it that. Yeah, and then we have the traders, and these traders are restricted entirely to the West African sample. Right? In Nairobi and Kampala, you don't find a single trader at the time, which also, well, probably not a big surprise because there were different gender roles also in terms of trading in between certainly Kenya and Uganda and West African places. And you might be actually surprised to say, oh, only 10% were traders in Accra. That's unlikely. I mean, if this was a representative sample, they should be probably 85%, I would say. But it's quite distinct that they occupy quite high categories, and we will do later something with those. It's also remarkable that they occupy quite high shares, because later we will argue that these high shares are actually an expression of resisting missionary domesticity, while in East Africa, the teaching of mission domesticity in schools aligned very well with pre-existing gender roles. While basically missionary domesticity teachers contested pre-existing entrepreneurial roles of women working outside the household and serving for the family, going against Victorian ideals, and actually colonial governments also complained about that, and missionaries as well. But I'm looking for even more quotes regarding this, because this is this tension, right, of missionary schooling teaching certain elements of domesticities. In West Africa, really women are working outside the household. Ibadan, almost half of them. In Freetown, 30%. So I'm looking for some literature that is also working on that, while they're completely absent here. I think I will skip.
If you want to leave 10 minutes for a discussion,
yeah.
You have 6 minutes.
Okay, and then I will skip just a few things. I want to talk briefly about men, and this is just taking Freetown and Kampala to show you that in blue, men are working in informal jobs much more, right? In red, females, and blue, men, and this is that men were able to access these jobs. This is, you can make this. I'm sure if I'm skipping this because I still have more to say. Yeah, maybe I briefly do this, but I won't show you the regression. So one question that arose to us is that women barely participating in wage labor pre-1930 and pre-1920, even less. There brings up the question, so why did parents send the daughters to school in the first place? Right? As an economist, you think about benefits, monetary benefits to this, but there might be other benefits to that as well. But there is, of course, this is odd, right? If you think the high opportunity costs that could be helping in the field, right? If all this education is not leading to any labor market outcomes, the economist is wondering. There might be other outcomes, social networks, maybe you meet your husband in church, all these other things, or belonging, one sense of belonging as well. But we are asking that, and then there's some literature by Fiona Leach who says, well, Christian education increased enormously girls' chances of making a good marriage in 19th century Freetown, and we are able to test this with our data, and what we show is that literary women are more likely to marry high status grooms, more likely to marry grooms who have a better occupation than the father of the bride, and grooms of high status fathers themselves. That all works across the board. And also that the father of the groom also works between generation, that they marry grooms who have a father who have a better occupation than the father of the bride. So it works across anything. We were surprised. So herewith this is confirmed, what Fiona Leach hypothesized, that at least for the period where we have a lot of variation in terms of literacy, you can't test this anymore in a time when everybody is literate. So we are just asking, if the bride is literate, what's her chances of marrying an upper class groom, and all these categories I just mentioned. Okay. Yeah. So this is the key graph to remember. It looks very similar to the one I showed you before. So this is now taking all the occupations, our coding of formal labor of men and women, and creating a gender gap. So basically, if the wife is not in the labor market, she's coded a 0, and the husband is a 1. And then you do this in a large data set, and that would tell you, so a 1 would be 100% gender inequality. All men work in the formal labor market, women 0. Right? So that's how to look at this graph. And you see that at the start there was basically very little formal access to formal jobs. But then you see this rise over the early colonial era in terms of gender inequalities peaking here, and then what we have seen when women en masse enter formal jobs, our Anglican women, this starts to decline. So you have this inverse U-shape, this build-up of gender inequality among the Christian elite in the capital cities, and then this quite fast decline, ending up at levels where they were in 1910. And we stop here in 1970. We can throw in our the British settlers as well, and we see a similar dynamic, maybe a bit more faster again, but those British couples who marry in Lagos, in Nairobi, they follow also similar trends, right? What is striking to us, despite being these places very far away from each other, the experience in terms of patterns is very similar, right? Which we find quite striking and think. As I said, the last question is what explains this late colonial gender convergence. I mentioned that already, but we can also visualize it by distinguishing wage labor jobs by their type. And in Freetown, all these gray colors are not amazing, but we see that the majority who were working in formal jobs were teachers. Same in Kampala. I'm just picking out 2. I can't show you 6 now. And also nurses, right? They were completely dominated. But here we see really from the administration jobs start to enter in the 1940s and increase. It's really the administration, but also the expansion of education that is driving women's appearance informal work. Okay? Same in Kampala, but a bit to a less extent. Okay. So let me wrap up. Yeah, last slide before is this observation that we don't have basically any traders in Kampala and Nairobi. So if you just focus on Freetown and Accra, there are quite a number. Obviously, there should be even more, but we find it stunning that we have still at almost 40% of women still identify as being a trader. They have not basically the brainwashing, the missionary brainwashing, we argue, was not sufficiently successful, that they still keep self-identifying with that occupation that goes against Victorian ideals. So this to us is a sort of a expression of that, while in East Africa and Kampala and Nairobi, they never had these roles, and in general we find that Nairobi and Kampala, they align much more with at least pre-existing gender ideas, much more with the Victorian domesticity ideas the missionary actually brought. Maybe that was also why they were quite successful in Uganda. But that's a different hypothesis for a different paper. So I will leave it here with our quantitative sort of take and coding of marriage registers I collected and trying to distill from the secondary literature hypothesis and trying to answer them and showing trends of the elite that some have in the 80s and 90s, like Christina Mann on Lagos, have started to work on, and we try to put some numbers onto that. So that's that.
Thank you.